Well, hello YouTube, it's me, Fortmaster, and welcome back to another Laserpick reaction. This is a lot sooner than I thought one would show up. I could have sworn that, Laserpick usually puts out stuff a lot slower, but hey, I'm not complaining. Yeah, so this episode, it's our T-34s in Ukraine. Which, it's like, I may not like the Russians in this war, but even then, I hope they're not that stupid, because I know they have newer tanks than that to put onto the field. What was it, the T-60, I think it was? Anyway, let's actually get into this.
This video is sponsored by the news! But what is ground news? Well folks, this is the second time I've run an ad for ground news, and I think some of you all didn't quite understand what it was all about. Honey, who are you even talking to? So why don't I explain? We're at dinner. What ground news is one of the first news comparison websites. You log on and click an article, and it will give you a brief overview of the situation, and then list all other websites covering that story with links directly to their articles. Honey, can we not do this, please? Can we just eat dinner normally? Yes, it does sound great, Susan. My name's not Susan, but better than that, it will tell you what side of the political spectrum those articles are on, their reputation for being factual, and even if they're owned by giant media conglomerates, allowing you to spot media bias. You know what? I'm just gonna leave. I'm just gonna leave. And best of all, those decisions on factuality are made by 3 independent media watchdogs, not just some dumb blonde in the office with a grudge making these calls. Okay, that is a highly offensive stereotype. I'm getting in the car. Oh no, you don't. You can't run from the news. Ground News will highlight articles and stories that you may have missed. Stuff the algorithm of other major networks will try to keep from you.
He's running after her.
Home at last.
Talking about the news.
Action Ground News will also highlight your own political biases, allowing you to bypass media biases and echo chambers. Get out of my house. Ground News also offers global coverage, allowing you to watch and compare regional and local news from across the world. That's it. I'm calling the police. It's important to seek diverse opinions, especially in this day and age. And best of all, it's the price of a cup of coffee. Ground News. I use this service, so why aren't you? Go to this URL or click my little link in the description to start your grounding of the news. It will change your goddamn life. It changed mine. I think it has become a bit of a meme at this point, especially among those of the typical military shitposting crowd, as to when we might see the deployment of T-34s to the front line. The idea that Russia might deploy its reserves of T-34 tanks has become such a focus for many people that any possibility of a sighting of one has been latched onto with the same mannerism as a starved addict attacking a bag of flour. The Second World War medium tank, though most that are still around were post-war constructions, is one of World War II's most persistent tanks, with many countries still holding at least one in service, even if they are largely kept in reserve. Russia holds a significant stockpile of working T-34s that are technically in service, but that service is in much the same way that the British 1759 first-rate ship-of-the-line HMS Victory is still technically in service.
Yeah,
and still
it's technically the flagship,
but its use is largely ceremonial. They're not going to sail it into battle anytime soon, as much as I wish they would. The use of reserve T-34s is almost exclusive to parades, memorial events, film shoots, or for hire by reenactors. They are in no way equipped to be actual reserve tanks, nor expected to see battle anytime soon.
Well, that's it. You heard him. That's the video. I don't know what the next 17 minutes of this are going to be about.
I'm so sorry to disappoint you. I'm not. I lied. But since the Second World War, there has been an odd tradition that in any war Russia participates in, a T-34 shows up, even if it has been deployed by the opposing side. And with Russia now having lost over 5,000 armored vehicles in Ukraine, the question not far from anyone's lips is when? When will Putin send them in? Now, of course, Russia might be a little bit desperate.
Oh yeah, I saw those.
Desperate, but
little bit.
I don't think they are that desperate.
Yeah, because it was the T-60. Am I misremembering what it was called? They have a bunch of those that they were sending off somewhere. I forgot. I can't remember now.
At least not yet. But the thing is, the idea of a T-34 potentially seeing action in this conflict, even if it is just as a training vehicle, is not that far-fetched. Now, not that long ago, we saw some evidence that Russia was deploying its older reserve T-62 tanks.
62? Okay.
This was at the time, which was a few months ago by now. They're doing mass recruitment. They're trying to raise new divisions, and 2 out of the 800-man divisions they are supposedly going to try and raise are armored divisions. Surely these older tanks will be training vehicles or in use by rear guard reserve divisions. I was wrong. I was so very wrong. A number of T-62Ms, which is basically just a normal T-72A but with better optics and the option for a guided missile system, were spotted in and around the city with the unpronounceable name. This is me, I'm not even going to attempt that. And several T-62MVs, which is basically just an M but with some ERA slapped onto it, had been encountered around Kherson. Exactly why these tanks are now on the front lines has been a topic of some debate, and theories of Russia having lost far more tanks than current estimates to a simple problem of supply issues has been thrown about. The thing is, these tanks should not be on the front lines, and the fact that they are shows a rather severe problem with the reality we envision when it comes to Russian armored divisions. Because if we take our current understanding of Russian tank numbers, Russia would have to lose 3 times as many tanks as it currently has before it even begun to run out of reserve T-72s alone.
Again, but Moskva, how many of those tanks in reserve are usable? I mean, again, we go back to the whole thing where some of the applique armor on some of the T-72s and stuff like that was full of cardboard.
Its tank losses would have to be heading close to the tens of thousands before T-62s started to come out of the warehouse. So what is going on? Well, firstly, I have to do a little bit of deprogramming you. There is a huge, an alarmingly huge number of people who are under the impression that the Russian military complex works purely as a patriotic program, that companies and their engineers are motivated not by greed and by the promise of an early retirement and a fat paycheck like those fat cats down at the Pentagon, but driven by the desire for their country to be seen as the greatest, to show off their skills and expertise to the greater world by producing far superior, greater crafted weapons of a much higher quality than that of the United States. That is not true. Russia has the same problems as America does when it comes to its industrial military complex, just in different ways. To put it bluntly, it's corrupt as fuck. The corruption in any Russian government department makes the Pentagon look like a sitcom from the 70s. Slightly racist and everyone's off their tits on cocaine, but your dad finds it funny. Not only is Russia corrupt, corruption is almost a way of life. I mean, I've witnessed it firsthand. One of my ex-boyfriends is Russian. I've been to Russia, and I've been lectured by former Russian military veterans, granted with the translator because it's a big old Russian guy trying to speak English and a big old Scottish guy trying to speak English. On the corruption they partook in, and why it was not only necessary, but almost seen as a rite of passage. They don't really see it as corruption, per se. Any side hustle you might have is just kind of seen as a perk. If your workplace gets a shiny new lamp and you're the manager, well, that lamp is yours. Everything in that office belongs to you. You're the manager. You can take it home and sell it later if you like. That's fine in the eyes of the public. And anyone who doesn't take advantage of that is almost looked down upon with suspicion, because if you're not taking advantage of it, then you're probably a pencil pusher who is going to rat out everybody else, so no one really trusts you. Now, I hear you cry, what does that have to do with tank numbers? Shut up, I'm getting there!
Everything I would have to think.
One of the least respected, lowest paid, and easiest jobs in the Russian army is the commander of a supply depot. It's a dead-end job, and for the majority of their life, someone who runs a supply depot is not really expected to do much. They fill in paperwork, they occasionally grant requisition requests, but if your supply depot is a stockpile, those requisition forms are never really going to come in, and when they do, they don't exactly ask for much. Your life is going to be bitter, boring, and highly underpaid. So if you want to sell off some of those old tanks at the very end of the yard off for scrap metal, well, I mean, no one's going to miss them, are they? Spare parts for your Lada? Sure, I can sell you something. Hey, you want a box of grenades? Seriously, when I was visiting my ex many years ago, he walked straight into a supply depot and purchased a box of grenades straight from the fucking commander, who was sitting on a box of ammunition, smoking. Fucking legend. He had the prices set up on the wall behind him and even asked if I'd like a souvenir and tried to sell me a Tokarov. It was amazing. We sat throwing sack grenades into the forest one night and kept score of how many trees we could knock over. It was very romantic. I mean, me and my ex did that, not me and the commander. That would have been weird. But also, if your local hunter needs a new rifle and some ammo, sure, smuggler comes a-knocking, or maybe your favorite friendly neighborhood arms dealer.
There's nothing better for an arms dealer than the combination of disgruntled soldiers and warehouses full of weapons.
Seriously, the memoirs of Colombian drug lord Ludwig Fannberg are worth a read if you haven't already. He admitted the Russian mafia was prepared to sell him a nuclear submarine, plus captain and crew, to smuggle cocaine into the US.
What?
Allegedly, he was even asked with missiles or without. This was the point he decided that he didn't want to do this anymore. They get away with this kind of shit because...
nuclear submarine. That's a bit of an escalation from drug lord. Yeah, I can kind of sympathize with him a little bit there.
No one is ever going to request this stuff. No one is ever going to ask for it. No one is checking on you. No one is counting it. No one is even really sure how much you had to begin with. So if you run a stockpile depot that says you have 600 tanks and someone comes along and asks you, how many tanks do you have here? Are you really going to stand up and say, sure, let me go count them all? No. You're going to say, I have 600 tanks, and the inspector will nod and walk away, because he isn't going to count them all either. No one is going to check that because no one else is counting, because, well, paperwork says you have 600 tanks, you say you have 600 tanks, inspector says you have 600 tanks, you have 600 tanks. How many tanks are actually in the depot? That's a bit dubious at best. Second to that, in order to help pay for the modernization of Russia's military and to keep the country afloat in the 90s, Russia began selling off its older reserve tanks, in particular the T-72. If you'll cast your mind back to before the Ukraine invasion at the Tank Olympics, often accused of being a propaganda-controlled scripted event for the cameras, the T-72 topped out gold in every category. And surprise, surprise, the result meant that a decent number of nations looking to replace their aging tank fleets suddenly wanted the new model T-72s being offered. New T-72s started showing up in Nigeria, Kenya, Algeria, Armenia, India, Slovakia, Siberia, Czechia, Syria, Uganda, Venezuela, and Vietnam, though Vietnam is allegedly yet to receive theirs. I wonder why. What this means is the 3,000 T-72s the Russians supposedly have in reserve may or may not actually exist. We don't know how many have been sold off or lost by the stockpile commanders, or how many had their engines sold off or were cannibalized for spares by active units. No one has updated the count since 2012, and that count was more than likely based off paperwork that was signed off in 1997. This is why the Russians are now digging out the T-62s, tanks that were marked as obsolete in the 70s, and they don't exactly have a lot of them. Supposedly they have around 2,000 of them, all of which were supposed to have been scrapped in 2013. However, roughly 500 of them were transferred to the Syrian army sometime in 2015, leaving allegedly 600 vehicles of various marks that have been reactivated for the Ukraine invasion. The conditions of these tanks varies greatly, and several Russian tankers who were captured and consequently interviewed admitted they surrendered because their tank just didn't work. Statistically, if we go by what we know, what I know anyway, what I've been told by former Russian officers and what has been estimated by British intelligence, roughly 1/3 of these T-62s are in working order, or can be brought quickly back into working order. Another third requires slightly longer, more dedicated repairs, and the final third are spare parts. Basing on the conditions the Ukrainians are finding these tanks in, and by the supposed confessions of their crew, Russia has taken that second third and just thrown them into combat regardless. And as this war continues, more from that second third are going to be arriving on the front line. I mean, we've already seen convoys of T-62s lacking ERA protection, hatches, or even gun barrels. Also keep in mind the T-62 does not have an autoloader, meaning any T-62 on the battlefield must have to be loaded manually, which means an extra crew member being required to do something that Russia has absolutely no training for. But T-62s are somewhat fitting to that old Russian stereotype, rugged and reliable. They're easy to use and there's nothing really much that can go wrong with them. Now, granted, you can't just cold start an engine that's been sitting around exposed to the elements for 40 years, but it is part of the Russian tank tanker training to pick out a tank from the depot and get it working again. This is what my ex did. He was a tank driver. Because he's 5'4", so obviously they'd grab him and put him in a tank. Get in the fucking tank, shorty.
Uh-huh.
That was a terrible Russian impression, sorry.
Yeah, that sort of thing. Like, if I was to join the army, or just the armed forces in general, I'd either be put in logistics just because of my size, or I'd be put in the Navy, and I'd be in charge of loading the magazine for the 5-incher on the front deck.
Get in tank, shorty. Duh.
Or, just regular field soldier,
anyway,
I guess.
With partial mobilization and massed force conscription now underway across Russia, somewhere between 300,000 and 1.2 million conscripts are about to go through roughly a month of training in about 2 weeks' time.
You say that, and yet we're getting reports of people having 1 day of training and already being sent to the front line. So, we have no idea what's going on.
Before being redeployed to the front line. This means Russia has about 2 weeks to find equipment for 1 million people, and among these new recruits, it is hoped to raise somewhere between 2 to 4 additional armoured divisions. Good luck there. Now keep in mind the 1st Guards Tank Division has been completely wiped out. They don't exist anymore. The 4th have lost almost all their tanks, and the 3rd arrived in Kherson with T-62s, of which only half were operational. Now, Russia is still producing tanks on the more modern T-90 variants, but is lacking a good supply of steel to maintain output, so production has been slowed somewhat and concentrated mostly on getting their older variants up to a modern standard.
Major Hearts of Iron 4 moment right there.
What tanks they do produce are more than likely to be earmarked for people already well trained on their use. More than likely, they'll just re-equip the 4th Guard, who made the probably correct decision to abandon their vehicles and save the crews during the counterattack in Kherson. As I keep trying to remind people, you can rebuild a tank, you can't rebuild a human life. So for these new divisions, raw recruits, most of them who have seen service but might not have ever served in a tank before, the options are somewhat limited. Typically, we are looking at one of 3 possibilities, or knowing Russia, a combination of all 3. The most likely scenario being that they have a lot more T-62s than current estimates, and will continue to supply these forces with a mixture of old tanks. Second scenario, they will supplement the lack of tanks with armoured vehicles of the BMP and BTR series. Third scenario, well, they may still somehow have reserves of old T-54 and T-55 tanks. I mean, they claim they don't have any of these left, but they also claim not to have any T-62s left, so, that was a lie. So how many they have is actually a matter of some debate. They could start raiding museums for tanks. There are supposedly around 30 T-54s and 55s of mixed variants at Kablinka and Patriotic Park, which, though not combat ready, are in considerably better condition than most of the T-62s. These are your most likely scenarios. The T-62s that we have seen on the front lines have largely been in use by the DPR forces, which are typically the people you see with the Second World War rifles and equipment, or in use as indirect fire weapons to replace the heavy number of artillery guns they've lost. So option 1, most likely scenario. But it is fun to speculate. Assuming they have no T-55s, and they actually run out of T-62s or for whatever reason cannot operate them, what else can they do? Well, surprisingly, quite a lot before they'd even consider deploying T-34s.
Yeah,
Russia's allies,
that's what this video was about.
As well as countries aligned with or within Russia's sphere of influence, such as India, do hold a large number of reserve tanks.
What?
And Russia could request them as part of its anti-terrorist campaign, or more than likely just outright buy them. China has also been gradually creeping up on Russia as one of the main arms suppliers for budget militaries, and it would be more than willing to sell off some of its older model tanks, but probably not its newer stuff. I'm not so sure the Chinese are really willing to risk watching an entire division of their brand new battle tanks get blown up by Western firearms, or worse, risking one getting captured. Now, I'm not particularly...
Oh, yeah, that... I can think of a number of countries that would really like to get their hands on something like that.
Worried if they do. I have seen quite a lot of propaganda videos on these tanks and actions and noticed there's quite a lot. That bit of gun wobble there. Strong potential that gun is not stabilized, which means having to stop to fire accurately, which makes them pretty fucking vulnerable. You go ask the chieftain what happens when you're in a tank that has to stop during the middle of a battle. And if Ukraine gets more modern NATO tanks, such as the Abrams and the Leopard 2, which has been proposed and is not completely off the table, then, okay, yeah, I say it all the time, tanks do more than just fight other tanks, but at the same time, if your enemy is able to field much better tanks and much more powerful tanks than you can, you're not going to have an easy time, especially if you're from an army that typically tends to rely on tanks to form the armored fist of any assault. So, can we expect T-34s on the front lines? At a push? Maybe. It's very possible as more T-62s find their way into Russian hands, there will be less to supply the DPR and other local insurrection forces,
And
even as these units get merged into the Russian army. Assuming Russia goes through with annexing most of eastern Ukraine, these units are not likely going to get better treatment. So there is a slim, very slim, possibility that at some point they might end up with a T-34 or two, probably stolen from a museum. But as actual Russian frontline units? Maybe in 100 years' time, when the hordes of the Vatnik warriors from the Zealands face off against the united dog tribes of NATO over the last few precious drops of gamer girl bathwater in the radiation-filled apocalyptic wastelands, we might see T-34s used in battle once again. And perhaps, on that day, you'll wonder what all of this was ever about. What started this war, even if it was ever worth it. And on the horizon, a towering shape will block the sunlight from your eyes. A hand will gently pat you on the shoulder, and a voice will ask, "Warriors, what is best in life?"
Point in World War II, not actually have enough working T-34s, so they bought a bunch from Rose in exchange. On a one-for-one basis, these T-34s and coincidentally all the T-34s on Victory Parade are Czechoslovakian T-34s built in 1955. Really?
What the fuck did I just make? Ah, fuck it, I'm not changing it now.
Well, that was certainly something. Yeah, so, I mean, the whole question about, like, T-34s possibly joining in, I mean, oh god, if we actually see actual combat footage of T-34s going on this battlefield, I mean, that's just going to be that is literally going to be the death knell of saying it's like, oh yeah, Russia's Russia's already been losing, but I mean, just all of this is just terrible. I mean, it's funny sometimes, but still, ugh. Okay, well, gonna call that. So I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not. I mean, if you want to support me on my Patreon. Other than that, I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.